A castle can begin as a shape in the dark, a square of stone, a watchtower, a wall, a place where someone once stood and looked outward into weather, fields, and distance. And from that simple shape, so many fantasy kingdoms have quietly grown. The idea is familiar now, almost comforting: a keep on a hill, a banner in the wind, a road leading to a market gate, a king inside, a story waiting in the stones. Tonight, we can wander through the old places that gave fantasy its steady bones, and move slowly enough to notice how small details became whole worlds. It is a gentle kind of history, because castles are not only about war. They are also about doors, ladders, hearth fires, storage rooms, wells, kitchens, wool, horses, muddy boots, and the careful work of keeping people warm. Fantasy often remembers the tallest part first, the tower, the wall, the throne room, but the real heart of a castle was often practical. A fortress had to hold grain, it had to hold water, it had to hold a community, sometimes a family, sometimes a garrison, sometimes a court that looked grand from a distance and ordinary up close. That mix of ordinary and grand is part of why castles feel so alive in imagined kingdoms. They are symbols, yes, but they are also homes and forts and storage spaces, and in a quieter way, machines for surviving winter. If you picture a fantasy kingdom, you may picture a central hall with a long table, a fire at one end, and candles glowing in small pools of gold. That image comes from many places at once. Real medieval halls varied a great deal, but the sense of gathering, of lore and meal and message in one room has stayed with us. A ruler needed a place to receive complaints, to reward loyalty, to settle disputes, and to keep the rhythm of a realm. Fantasy loved that idea and made it more visible. The hall became the stage where banners hung, where minstrels played, where messengers arrived from rain-swept roads, and where the day of a kingdom seemed to turn on a few spoken words. It is a soft kind of drama, really, because the room itself is doing much of the work. Stone, timber, smoke, fabric, and silence can all make a kingdom feel larger than the person sitting inside it. Long before modern fantasy games, castles had already become symbols in the public imagination. People saw them in ruins, in old chronicles, in paintings, and in the stories told around fireplaces. Some castles remained useful, lived in and repaired, while others slowly became picturesque shells. A broken tower on a hill can be even more powerful than a whole fortress because ruin leaves space for the mind to complete the shape. Fantasy artists understood this well. They took real castles, softened or enlarged them, and placed them in worlds where the sky was wider, the forests deeper, and the old walls carried the feeling of forgotten ages. The result was not a perfect copy of history. It was something more dreamlike, a history remembered through mist. And kingdoms too became simpler in fantasy, but not in a careless way. Real kingdoms were often complicated, stitched together by marriages, taxes, promises, border disputes, and long arguments over inheritance. Yet fantasy often kept the visible parts: a capital city, a royal road, a border keep, a noble house, a distant province, a map with names written in careful letters. This was useful for games, of course, because players needed to see the shape of the realm at a glance. But it also echoed older habits of storytelling. A kingdom is easier to picture when it has edges, and castles make those edges visible. They mark places where order ends and uncertainty begins, where a road narrows, where a valley closes in, where someone has to decide who may pass and who may not. There is something restful about these boundaries. A wall is a simple thing, but in fantasy it becomes almost ceremonial. The gatehouse says, "Here is safety." The bridge says, "Here is entry." The tower says, "Here is watchfulness." Even the moat, muddy and still, has a kind of sleepiness to it when imagined from a distance, though of course it was never meant to be peaceful. It was meant to slow, to discourage, to make an enemy hesitate. Fantasy keeps the shape of that hesitation. A traveller approaches the castle at dusk, a lantern moves near the gate, and the whole world becomes smaller for a moment, focused on one entrance, one threshold, one conversation with a guard who may or may not be in a good mood. In many games, the first castle is not the grandest one. It is the safe one. It is the place you return to after roads, monsters, quests, and weather. That feeling has old roots. Real castles and fortified towns offered shelter in uncertain times. They gathered goods, people, and authority into a smaller space. Even when life inside was not easy, the boundary itself offered a kind of relief. Fantasy transformed this practical comfort into emotional architecture. The castle became a checkpoint for belonging. To enter meant you were known, or at least permitted. To leave meant the wider world returned, with its forests, marshes, distant mountains, and roads that might be empty for miles. The fantasy kingdom also borrowed from the visible language of medieval Europe, though not only from Europe. It took the pointed roof, the banner, the king's seal, the feasting hall, the knight, the town square, the watchtower, the monastery, the market cross, the stone bridge. Some of these details were taken because they were beautiful, others because they were clear. A castle silhouette is easy to recognize from far away. So is a town wall, a drawbridge, or a cluster of rooftops around a central keep. Game artists and world builders learned quickly that players need landmarks they can read instantly. A good kingdom map is a kind of promise. It says that the world has structure and that even its mysteries have borders. But real medieval life was not always neat, and fantasy sometimes becomes most interesting when it remembers that. A castle was not only a place of glory. It could smell of animals, damp wood, smoke, boiled cabbage, and wet wool. Hallways could be draughty. Floors could be uneven. Stairs could be steep and narrow, made to help defenders, not guests. A royal bedchamber in some periods and places might be less private than modern listeners imagine. Servants, messengers, and retainers moved through spaces that today would feel intimate. This is one reason fantasy castles can feel oddly comforting even when they are dangerous. They are large but not sleek. They are busy but not sterile. They are places where life is visibly lived in. The oldest castles that inspired later fantasy were not always castles in the later fairy tale sense. Some were motte and bailey fortifications, raised on earth mounds with wooden defences. Others grew from Roman remains, from hill-fort traditions, from palisaded enclosures, from local stonework, from long habits of defence in a landscape that rewarded caution. Over centuries those forms changed. Wood gave way to stone in many places. Great keeps rose, then later became less central as walls expanded around whole towns. Towers grew more elegant in some eras, more practical in others. The fantasy image tends to gather all these periods together. A single imagined fortress may contain a Roman road, a Norman keep, a Gothic hall, and a later palace wing, all at once. It is historically impossible, perhaps, but emotionally effective, because it gathers many centuries into one place where the mind can rest. And that is one of the quiet secrets of fantasy kingdoms. They are often not trying to be exact, they are trying to feel old. Age in fantasy is not only a number, it is the weight of stories. A castle with moss in the cracks feels older than one with clean stone, even if that moss is only a visual suggestion. A kingdom with faded banners feels older than one with bright colours. A road lined with worn statues feels older than a road with fresh paving. Game worlds use these clues carefully. They give us cracked courtyards, weathered stairs, half-collapsed walls, and libraries with dust on the shelves. The effect is not sadness exactly. It is continuity. It tells us that the place has outlived many seasons and is still standing, quietly, the way old places do. The castle in fantasy games often stands at the center of a map, but the kingdom itself is usually spread outward in rings. Close to the castle are the nobles, the guards, the craftsmen, the workshops, and the roads maintained with special care. Farther out are farms, forests, mines, borderlands, and smaller settlements. This is not unlike real kingdoms, which depended on the slow movement of food, taxes, timber, salt, metal, and people. A crown is an object, but a kingdom is a network. Fantasy sometimes remembers this network in gentle ways, through wagon routes, supply lines, inns, toll bridges, and messengers riding at dawn. Even a magical kingdom still needs someone to mend the bridge after a storm. There is also something deeply appealing about the idea that a kingdom can be known by its architecture. In fantasy, a strong, upright castle may suggest an orderly realm. A crooked, dark fortress may suggest old grudges or difficult magic. A bright palace can imply wealth, ceremony, and careful rule. A half-buried ruin can hint at lost dynasties, vanished disasters, or something older than the present government. Real architecture also carries these signals, though less neatly. A fortress built on a cliff says one thing, a palace near a river says another. A town wall that has been repaired many times says patience. A tower built from different stones says history layered over history. Fantasy borrowed this visual language and made it legible at a glance, as if stone itself could speak. Sometimes the most memorable fantasy castles are the ones that seem slightly impractical. A tower reaches too high. A stair twists too tightly. A hall stretches farther than it needs to. A gate opens onto a dramatic bridge with no obvious need for such grandeur, but those choices are part of the charm. Human beings have always built not only for use but for meaning. A ruler wants to be seen. A city wants to impress. A border lord wants to signal strength. Even in the real world, castles and palaces often carried messages beyond defense. They declared permanence. They said in stone that someone expected to remain. Fantasy took that message and let it echo across hills and valleys so that every fortress seemed to whisper, "We are still here." That feeling of being still here matters in bedtime listening because it is steady and soft. The imagined kingdom does not rush. Its roads are long but predictable. Its towers are old but dependable. Its walls stand in moonlight. Even danger in fantasy often has a ritual shape. Gates close. Torches are lit. Watchmen change at regular hours. The realm continues by habit. This gives the listener a place to settle, almost like a bench in a quiet courtyard. We are not required to solve the whole kingdom tonight. We only need to notice that it exists, that it has form, and that its form has been borrowed little by little from real places where people once lived and worked and waited for weather to pass. If we wander now into the world of game design, we can see how castles became not only symbols but systems. A castle in a strategy game might produce troops, store resources, protect territory, or serve as a center for decision-making. A kingdom might expand through roads, alliances, trade, and careful placement of settlements. These rules may seem modern, but they echo old realities. Fortified centers mattered because control of space mattered. Distance mattered. Access to water mattered. The ability to gather grain before winter mattered. Game systems simplify these truths into numbers and icons, but the feeling remains human and ancient. Protection first, then expansion. Shelter first, then authority. A wall before a banquet, a gate before a kingdom. And yet games also gave castles another life, one that was not purely military. They became homes for quests, treasures, secret passages, lost libraries, courtyards overgrown with ivy, and hidden chambers that seemed to remember the people who left them. This is where fantasy and history share a tender overlap. Real castles preserve traces of daily life, even now in worn stone steps and uneven floors. Games amplify that feeling. A forgotten chapel might be placed beside a royal garden. A collapsed tower might conceal a map room. A cellar might hold old barrels, tools, and a single locked chest. The details are small, but they matter because they make the castle feel inhabited by time. Many fantasy kingdoms also draw from the romance of dynasties, the idea that a house, a bloodline, or a banner can outlast generations. Real history is full of such continuity, though it is often less smooth than stories make it seem. Houses fall, lines end, titles are disputed, marriages rearrange the map. A castle that belonged to one family may later belong to another, then another again. Fantasy often turns this instability into a clear lineage, with heraldry, mottos, and old claims carved into memory. A crest on a shield can carry a whole political argument. A lion, a stag, a dragon, a tower, a rose. Each one can suggest a house, a region, a promise, or a grievance. It is a gentle sort of code, one that invites the viewer to wonder who first chose those colors and why. Heraldry itself is very bedtime friendly in a way. It is orderly, patterned, and full of animals that are more symbolic than real. Lions stand for courage, eagles suggest reach and height, stags can suggest noble forests and old hunting rites, dragons bring fire, ancestry, and a little awe. Shields painted in bright fields of red, blue, black, white, and gold make a kingdom feel organized, even when the story beneath is messy. Fantasy games often use heraldry to help players read the world quickly, but also to create memory. A castle seen once can be recognized later by its colors alone. That is a quiet pleasure, the satisfaction of returning to a place by sign and shape, as if the kingdom had left breadcrumbs for the mind. In the history behind fantasy, there is also the matter of religion, shrine, and sacred space. Many real castles and towns stood near churches, monasteries, cathedrals, or older holy sites. Some fortresses guarded bridges that had spiritual as well as practical value. In fantasy, temples and chapels often sit close to the castle because power and belief have always lived near each other. A kingdom may be held together not only by law but by ritual. Bells ring, candles burn, oaths are sworn, festivals return each year. This gives fantasy worlds their calendar-like feeling, as if the turning of the seasons matters as much as the turning of armies. A kingdom is not only walls and taxes. It is also harvest feasts, winter prayers, coronations, and the long patient rhythm of time. The castle's relationship to time may be the most comforting part of all. A tree grows, a river shifts, a kingdom changes hands, but the castle stands, or at least remains visible in some form. Even ruins are a kind of endurance. Stones keep their shape longer than people do. This has made castles especially powerful in fantasy, where old places often carry memory in a nearly physical way. A stairway may remember footsteps. A gate may remember the pressure of hands. A hall may remember the pause before a speech. Of course, stone does not truly remember, but listeners have always liked to imagine that it does. History then feels less like a list and more like an atmosphere, something breathed in quietly. Some fantasy kingdoms lean toward the bright and orderly, with polished courts, clean roads, and cities laid out with almost geometric care. Others lean toward the weathered and irregular, with leaning towers, crooked lanes, and walls patched by many generations. Both styles borrow from history in different ways. The first recalls planned capitals, imperial grandeur, and the confidence of rulers who wanted their world to appear measured. The second recalls the organic growth of settlements around a stronghold, where useful paths became roads, and roads became streets, and streets became districts. In both cases, the castle serves as a visual anchor. It gives the listener or player a place to orient the imagination. There is a quiet pleasure in orienting oneself by castle rather than clock. A tower can mark noon by shadow. A bell can announce evening. The lowering sun can turn a wall from grey to amber. Fantasy games understand these small atmospheric changes well. They often place castles on high ground so that light moves across them beautifully during the day. At dawn, they can look cold and pale. At dusk, they can seem warm and nearly alive. In moonlight, they become shapes of certainty against the dark. This is one reason such images are so restful. The world is reduced to a few clear forms: a high wall, a low road, a distant village, and sky. Of course, fantasy castles also inherited a great deal from fairy tale, and fairy tale itself loves the old stronghold. A princess in a tower, a sleeping curse behind stone walls, a forbidden room, a secret staircase, a dragon near the gate, a lost prince in exile, all of these became familiar long before modern games. The castle is a container for thresholds. It can hide, protect, imprison, and transform. This flexibility makes it ideal for storytelling. A forest can be mysterious, but a castle can hold mystery in rooms. A mountain can be imposing, but a castle can be walked through. Fantasy games took this old narrative furniture and turned it into places we could explore room by room, as if turning the pages of a very quiet book. Even so, the worlds that shaped these castles were not all European. Many games borrow from Byzantine domes, Islamic palaces, Japanese forts, Persian gardens, Scandinavian timber halls, and the stone traditions of many regions. Fantasy kingdoms are often mixtures, assembled from visual memories of real architecture across time and place. That can be done carelessly, but it can also be done with affection. A distant watchtower might owe something to one tradition, while a courtyard fountain borrows from another. A roofline may be borrowed from the north, a tile pattern from the east, a gate from the west. The result is not a single historical setting, but a composite dream, which is often how the mind stores images anyway. And because fantasy is built from memory, it often feels more truthful than precise reconstruction would. Not truer in a scholarly sense, perhaps, but truer to how people remember old places after reading stories about them. The castle becomes the place where a king waits in silence. The kingdom becomes the place where roads lead outward into unknown lands. The wall becomes the border between the known and the not yet known. These are human ideas, not only historical ones. They recur because people have always needed shapes for security, for ambition, for belonging, and for distance. If you listen closely to many fantasy game soundtracks, you can almost hear this architecture in the music. Long notes, soft choirs, harp-like patterns, distant drums, and slow strings can make stone feel musical. This is not history, but it is related to the feeling of history. A castle is easier to imagine if it seems to echo. A kingdom feels larger if there is a hush before the wind. Music gives the walls an atmosphere, and atmosphere gives the walls memory. It is one more way that fantasy turns practical structures into emotional places. The older medieval world also offered fantasy many smaller details that might be easy to overlook. Iron rings on doors, wax seals on letters, market stalls under awnings, pages running errands, blacksmiths hammering in side streets, turrets hidden behind other roofs, tapestries that warmed walls and told stories, stone sinks, wooden shutters, herbs hanging to dry. These are the background textures that make a kingdom feel lived in. A game does not always need to explain them, it only needs to suggest them. The listener's mind does the rest, gently filling in the life of the place. That is one reason this subject works so well for bedtime. It invites participation without pressure. You do not have to solve the castle. You only have to imagine the quiet parts. There is also the matter of maps, which may be the calmest part of fantasy world building. A map of kingdoms and castles offers order without noise. Rivers curve, mountains gather, roads connect. Borders are drawn in careful lines. Towns appear as dots, keeps as icons, forests as shaded patches. Many people feel a sort of peace looking at such maps because they present complexity in a form the mind can hold. Real history is never so tidy, but the map teaches the imagination a rhythm. There are centers, edges, crossings, and routes. There are places that protect and places that supply. There are old roads that no one uses now, and newer roads that might one day fade into legend themselves. Some of the most memorable fantasy kingdoms are not the largest, but the most carefully shaped. A small mountain kingdom can feel complete if it has a gate, a hall, a temple, a market, and a few narrow roads climbing between houses. A coastal realm can feel rich if it has docks, towers, sea walls, and salt air. A forest kingdom becomes vivid if it has wooden palisades, raised walkways, and the sound of leaves beyond the last lantern. Real medieval settlements were similarly adapted to place. They fit the land around them, and fantasy does the same when it is attentive. A castle on a cliff is one story. A castle by a river is another. A castle at the edge of a marsh feels different again, as if the earth itself has chosen a mood. And perhaps this is why so many people return to castles in fantasy when they want to rest. A castle is a promise of shape. It does not need to be perfect to be reassuring. It only needs to be knowable. A round tower, a square keep, a courtyard, a gate, a hall, a stair. The mind can walk these spaces while the body stays still. It can imagine the coolness of stone underfoot and the warmth of a fire behind a heavy door. It can picture a servant carrying bread, a guard changing his cloak, a cook closing a latch, a child peering from a stair. Nothing needs to happen quickly. The kingdom can hold its breath. In older stories, castles were often where the test began. In fantasy games, they still are, but they are also where the player returns with better gear, with more knowledge, with a deeper sense of the world. The castle as home base is a modern comfort layered over an ancient form. It means that the fortress is no longer only a place to defend, but a place to belong. You might leave it to cross a swamp, climb a mountain, or enter a ruin, but eventually you return to its gates. There is a deep human pleasure in return. The road may be long, but the walls are familiar. That familiarity may explain why even fictional ruins can feel welcoming. A collapsed wall says time has passed, but also that something remained. An empty throne room still holds its shape. A forgotten courtyard still opens to the sky. A broken stair still suggests movement. Fantasy does not always need restoration to feel hopeful. Sometimes the old stones are enough. They stand or lean or settle into moss, and the listener senses continuity. The kingdom is not dead exactly. It is paused, waiting, sleeping under layers of weather. There is a calm human logic to all of this. When people build stories, they often borrow the forms that once kept them safe. Walls become narrative boundaries. Gates become decisions. Towers become vantage points. Keeps become centers. Thrones become symbols. Market towns become places of exchange and conversation. Forest roads become uncertainty. In this way, fantasy kingdoms are not only about escape, they are about making the world readable. They take the very old problem of living together in a difficult landscape and turn it into a map that can be followed by the imagination. And yet the imagination is free to linger on small things: a flag snapping softly in wind, a lantern in a guard window, a horse tethered near a stable, snow drifting against a wall, rain darkening the stone of a stair, a cat moving through the kitchen yard, a mason's mark on an arch, a rusted hinge, a carved lintel, a line of crows on a battlement. These are the kinds of details that make fantasy castles gentle enough for sleep because they are quiet, ordinary, and slightly romantic in their oldness. They ask nothing grand of us, they simply remain. If we think of the kingdom itself as a living body, then the castle becomes something like a heart or a spine. Messages travel to it, orders leave from it, festivals gather around it. In some games and stories, the capital is so central that every road seems to lead there. In others, power is decentralized, and castles are scattered like watchful stones across the land. Both arrangements have echoes in real history, where authority could be concentrated or fragmented, admired or contested, public or hidden behind thick walls. The fantasy version simplifies the politics but keeps the feeling of geography. Far hills are still far. Border marches are still border marches. The sea still matters. The mountain pass still matters. And the castle, standing in all that space, gives the world a center of gravity. Sometimes the most beautiful fantasy kingdoms are the ones that seem slightly worn, as if they have been inherited rather than invented. This inherited feeling is important. It tells us that the world existed before the current story began. Real castles do this very naturally, of course. They carry layers of rebuilding, modification, reuse, and repair. A window replaced, a wall thickened, a gate enlarged, a hall expanded, a chapel added. Fantasy often mirrors this by giving us old foundations with newer layers on top, a kingdom that feels assembled through time rather than built in a day. That is one of the reasons these worlds feel restful. They have already been there a long while. We have only just arrived. And now, as we continue to wander, we can notice how often fantasy turns from fortress to town, from town to countryside, from countryside to borderland, and then back again. This movement is very old. Real life in medieval kingdoms also moved by seasons and routes. Fair days, harvests, road conditions, river crossings, and the availability of protection all shaped where people went. Fantasy makes these patterns visible. A castle might anchor the land, but the roads between villages are what make the kingdom feel inhabited. A kingdom without small roads would feel hollow. A castle without a village nearby would feel lonely. So the best imagined realms tend to include both the great stone center and the small, patient lives surrounding it. Those small lives are perhaps the most comforting part of all. A baker rising before dawn, a smith heating the forge, a stable hand brushing a horse, a scribe sharpening a nib, a brewer stirring a vat, a child chasing geese near a wall, a farmer bringing grain through the gate. Fantasy kingdoms are often remembered for dragons and thrones, but they are built in the listener's mind from these quiet emotions. Games learn to add them in the background because a realm feels more real when there are markets to browse, inns to enter, and little domestic sounds drifting through the streets. The grand becomes believable when it is surrounded by ordinary work. There is a similar comfort in the idea of layers. Above ground, the keep rises. Below, the cellar cools. Beyond the wall, the fields stretch. Beyond the fields, the forest begins. Beyond the forest, a ruined shrine, a road, a hill, a distant tower. Fantasy kingdoms love layers because they allow the imagination to wander inward and outward at the same time. The castle is at once a closed world and a beginning. It is a place to enter, and also a place from which to leave. That dual purpose gives it its deep appeal. And perhaps, in the end, the history of fantasy kingdoms and castles is really the history of how people learn to make stone feel like belonging. The walls are real, the towers are real, the gates are real, but the feeling they create is larger than any one fortress. It is the feeling of order in a wide landscape, of shelter after travel, of memory held by old places, of a realm with a shape you can recognize even in the dark. Fantasy took those feelings and placed them in games, books, and artworks where they could be visited again and again. Not rushed, not solved, simply entered. So if you imagine a castle now, let it be a quiet one. Let the banner move a little in the evening air. Let the moat lie still. Let the torches glow without haste. Let the keep stand against the sky, broad and patient. Let the village beyond the walls settle into its own small darkness. Let the kingdom extend outward in roads and fields and low hills, and then soften into distance. There is no need to hurry through it. It is enough to notice the shape, the old shape, the shape that history lent to fantasy and fantasy returned to us as a place to rest. And as the night deepens, the castle remains softly outlined, while the road home or sleep becomes easier to find. Long before fantasy kingdoms were drawn in the style we now recognize, people were already thinking about power in terms of stone, distance, and visibility. A ruler needed to be seen, but not too closely. The seat of power had to feel near enough to command and far enough to inspire caution. That balance appears again and again in old histories. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats rose above the flat land like stairways made for the sky. In Egypt, temple complexes and fortress towns marked sacred and political space with deliberate care. In the ancient Near East, walls were not only defenses, they were declarations. A city enclosed itself and announced quietly but firmly that it had a center and that its center mattered. Fantasy kingdoms inherited this sense of centeredness. A capital city often stands in the middle of maps, even when the map has no true center at all. The image is reassuring. The eye can return to one place. It is a little like looking at a hearth from across a room. The room may be large, the shadows may move, but the fire is there. Ancient cities understood this instinct well. Their temples, palaces, and citadels gathered attention the way a candle gathers a dark room. Even when people lived in scattered quarters beyond the walls, the monumental center gave the whole place a shared memory. And memory is one of the quiet foundations of fantasy. Not only the memory of individual characters, but the memory built into stones, roads, and names. A castle in fantasy is rarely just a building. It is a record. It remembers siege and celebration, betrayal and feast, birth and burial, the old dynasty and the newer one that replaced it. Real castles often carried similar layers, though not always in tidy ways. A medieval fortress might begin as a wooden motte, then become a stone keep, then gain outer walls, towers, and a gatehouse. Over time, comfort crept in beside defense. Windows widened, halls brightened, a chapel appeared, then a kitchen, then a chamber for guests. Each addition tells a small story about how people gradually changed their expectations of safety. That slow change is especially soothing to think about at bedtime because it suggests that even strong places need not remain fixed. They can soften, they can adapt, they can become less severe without losing their dignity. Some of the oldest fortifications in the world were never purely military in the modern sense. They were also administrative, ceremonial, and symbolic. A hilltop stronghold could be a refuge, but it could also be a statement of continuity. The same is true in fantasy when a castle is used not only as a place of battle, but also as a place of counsel, marriage, training, storytelling, and inheritance. The more purposes a place can hold, the more fully it can live in the mind. There is something especially elegant about the older real-world precedents for these imagined strongholds. The Greek Acropolis, for example, offered a high place for protection and worship. It was not a castle in the later European sense, but it shares the same intuition. Higher ground invites both reverence and caution. On a hill, a city can watch the horizon. It can also be watched from afar. This mutual visibility created a natural drama that fantasy would later refine. From a distance, a tower looks solitary. Up close, it reveals staircases, walls, inner courtyards, and the ordinary complications of human life. That shift from simple silhouette to inhabited detail is one of the pleasures of world building. The ancient world was full of such transitions. A great wall could begin as rubble and mud brick, then become packed earth, then stone. A roadside station could become a market town. A defensive outpost could become a royal residence. Human settlements rarely arrive in their finished form. They accumulate. Fantasy often knows this instinctively, even when it presents itself in broad, elegant lines. The old gate may be named after an extinct house. The street may still follow a forgotten ditch. The tower might lean a little, not because the artist forgot, but because old places do. Small irregularities are what make a world feel lived in. That feeling is often strongest when a map includes borders that are not entirely certain. Real kingdoms were seldom crisp shapes with clean edges. They bled into marshland, forest, desert, and mountain. Control faded with distance. Trade routes mattered as much as armies. A lord might claim a valley, yet a clan in the hills could still move more freely than anyone liked. Rivers changed course, roads became muddy, passes closed with snow. The idea of a kingdom as a perfect, visible unit is more fantasy than history, and yet fantasy uses that simplification for a gentle purpose. It turns uncertainty into pattern. It gives the listener a place where boundaries can be understood, even if they are watched by wolves or dragons. The borderlands are especially interesting in this regard because they invite both danger and patience. In stories, the edge of the map is often where the unknown begins. In history, edges were usually where different communities met. A border market could hear several languages at once. A frontier keep could rely on local guides, local informants, local alliances. A monastery in a remote place might preserve texts, teach children, and shelter travelers. These are not dramatic facts, but they are restful ones. They remind us that history was not only made by conquest, it was also made by correspondence, by lending, by hospitality, by the slow exchange of grain and salt and stories. Fantasy kingdoms often include these exchanges in the background, even when the plot is about something grander. A road has to be maintained, horses need fodder, ships need safe harbours, tolls are collected, merchants worry about weather, caravans arrive late, a mapmaker redraws a river, a messenger brings a seal from another realm. The kingdom becomes believable through such practical concerns. It is a quiet miracle how many worlds feel more vivid because someone remembered to mention an innkeeper, a ferry, or a watch captain who sleeps in short shifts. The inn, in particular, is one of the most persistent and comforting places in fantasy. It is not as imposing as the castle or as mysterious as the ruins, but it is often where the world becomes human. Real medieval inns and taverns were places of gossip, contracts, meals, and temporary shelter. Travelers heard local news there. So did sailors, traders, pilgrims, and messengers. If a kingdom is a web of roots, the inn is one of its knots. Fantasy understands this. An inn can be a threshold, a pause, a place where the weather is observed and maps are unfolded. It can hold a fire, a stew, a few benches, and the sense that someone has arrived from somewhere else but has not yet left. There is a similar quiet usefulness in the market square. Markets are often described in lively terms, but at their heart they are about rhythms. Produce arrives early, cloth is weighed, metal is traded. A fishmonger knows the river tides. A potter knows the kiln. A cooper knows the season for wood. The market square gives a kingdom a pulse. It tells us that people are not only defending a place but living in it. In fantasy, the market also offers a place where classes meet in a limited and watchful way. Nobles can pass through, children can wander, travelers can listen. It is one of the few places where the whole kingdom seems briefly present at once. Some of the most enduring fantasy cities borrow from very old urban shapes. They may feel medieval on the surface, but beneath that surface they sometimes echo Roman grids, Islamic courtyards, Byzantine domes, or the dense organic streets of ancient port towns. The result is not historical purity, which is never truly possible in fantasy anyway, but emotional coherence. A city made of mixed influences feels old because old cities themselves were mixed. They borrowed, adapted, reused, and expanded. A temple became a church, a fortress became a palace became a museum, a road became a street, a wall became a boundary between neighborhoods. Each change leaves a trace, however faint. This layering is part of why ruins are so gentle in the fantasy imagination. A ruin does not need to explain everything at once. It can simply suggest that time has passed and that time leaves shapes behind. The ancient world left many ruins that inspire this feeling still. The weathered stones of Mycenae, the quiet colonnades of Palmyra, the broken outlines of cities in Anatolia, the still-standing arches of Rome, the half-buried remains of forgotten fortresses in arid valleys. Such places invite the mind to slow down. They are not empty exactly. They are full of absence, which is a softer kind of presence. Fantasy ruins do the same. They offer the listener a place where history has become visible through loss. There is no need to make a ruin dramatic for it to be moving. A toppled stair, a courtyard with grass in the cracks, a wall that now shelters birds, a doorframe standing alone, a mosaic no longer underfoot but open to the rain. These details are enough. They allow the imagination to wander without urgency. They also remind us that buildings are not eternal even when they seem firm. Stone erodes, timber burns, plaster falls away, yet the memory of a place can remain so strong that later people build around it, beside it, or on top of it. A ruined foundation can still shape a kingdom. That is one reason fantasy loves ancient capitals and lost dynasties. They provide depth without requiring constant action. A throne room becomes more interesting when it sits above older chambers. A family name becomes more resonant when its origins are half lost in legend. A prophecy feels quieter when it is attached to a tomb. Ancient civilizations understood the power of ancestry, and fantasy often translates that into lineages, relics, and old claims on the land. A crown may be inherited, forged, stolen, hidden, or rediscovered, but it always carries the weight of continuity. It is an object meant to condense time. The notion of continuity is also central to castles themselves. A castle was not merely built and forgotten. It was repaired, repainted, reinforced, expanded, besieged, surrendered, garrisoned, and inhabited by successive generations who often used it differently. Some families prized comfort more than defense. Some rulers preferred display to utility. Some fortresses slowly became administrative centers, then noble houses, then picturesque ruins. Fantasy likes to preserve all of these possibilities at once. A single castle can feel ancient and functional, ceremonial and vulnerable, all in the same scene. That emotional complexity is useful because it mirrors the complexity of real historical places. One can think of the way old fortifications often used the landscape itself. A river bend could protect one side, a cliff could guard another, a marsh could discourage attackers, a ridge could reveal movement from far away. Human architecture has always depended on reading terrain carefully. In fantasy, this becomes a pleasing kind of visual logic. The mountain kingdom sits high because it makes sense. The island fortress commands the straits because that is where control gathers. The forest keep hides because hiding is its strength. The city at the crossroads prospers because every road leads there. These arrangements feel restful because they imply that the world is ordered by geography as much as by politics. And geography itself is a kind of history. A valley remembers flood, a pass remembers ice, a desert remembers wind, a coastal city remembers tides and trade. Fantasy worlds often understand this better than they seem to at first glance. Their maps suggest that the land has a personality. Rivers are not just lines, they are routes, barriers, and sources of law. Mountains are not just decoration, they divide languages, weather, and loyalties. Forests conceal, but they also provide wood, game, medicine, and shelter. The kingdom is therefore not floating above its setting. It is nested inside it, just as a castle is nested inside its walls, and the walls inside a larger ecology of fields, roads, and watchtowers. Sometimes the ancient precedents for fantasy kingdoms are not European at all, though modern images often make them seem that way. The great fortified cities of the ancient world stretch across many cultures. The citadels of the Indus Valley, the walled centers of Assyria, the palatial complexes of the Levant, the hilltop settlements of the Mediterranean, the fortified compounds of pre-Columbian America, the elevated palace cities of East Asia, all contribute in different ways to the long human habit of making political space visible. Some had wide courtyards, some used mud brick walls that glowed warmly in the sun, some built on terraces, some used gates as ceremonial thresholds. The common thread is not a single style, but a shared instinct. Power likes to arrange itself in space. Fantasy takes that instinct and turns it into atmosphere. A castle is not only a shield, it is also a viewpoint. From the battlements, the kingdom can be surveyed in all directions. That elevated gaze has a psychological effect. It suggests order, yet it also suggests loneliness. The ruler at the top of the keep is both protected and separated. This is one reason castles feel so emotionally rich in fiction. They are homes, prisons, offices, sanctuaries, and symbols all at once. They are places where the walls mean safety, but also duty. A bedchamber in a castle can feel softer than a tent and heavier than a palace room because the stones around it have witnessed so much. In the oldest stories, strongholds often sit at the edge of human understanding. A fortified tower may guard a princess, an oracle, a sacred flame, or a secret name. A walled city may resist invaders not only with weapons but with ritual. The boundary between practical defense and symbolic protection is thin. Ancient people often believed that certain places needed both. Temples were guarded because they housed divine presence. Treasuries were guarded because they housed wealth. Gates were guarded because they marked transitions between order and the outside. Fantasy continues this blend, making the castle gate feel like a threshold not only of law, but of mood. To pass through it is to move from open land into a slower, older rhythm. That slowness is important. A bedtime story about kingdoms is not only about grandeur, it is about scale that can be absorbed without strain. A kingdom can be huge, but if it is described gently, it becomes navigable. One can imagine the main road first, then the village, then the river crossing, then the hill, then the keep on the hill. The mind likes such steps. It also likes recurring shapes. A round tower here, a square tower there, a bridge, a stair, a courtyard, a gatehouse, a moat, a chapel, a stable yard. Each shape repeats with small variations like an old tune played in another key. The castle yard itself is a particularly quiet place in this sense. Even when alive with work, it has a contained feel. Hounds may lie in the shade, armor may hang on pegs, water may be drawn from a well, an apprentice may carry a bundle of rushes, a cook may send steam into the air. In fantasy art, these ordinary details often sit at the edge of the composition, almost unnoticed, but they are what anchor the grander elements. Without them, the castle would be only architecture. With them, it becomes a place where people must have lived, waited, listened, and slept. It is interesting how often fantasy assumes that a kingdom's greatest strength lies in its stone, when in fact the true strength of any realm is usually in its networks. Roads, alliances, grain stores, local loyalties, river traffic, seasonal labor, and the ability to communicate across distance matter more than any single fortress. Ancient kingdoms understood this too. A palace could fall, but the bureaucracy might survive. A city could be sacked, but trade might resume. A dynasty could collapse, but its roads could continue to shape movement for centuries. Fantasy likes the visible center, yet the invisible structures beneath it are what give the world its depth. There is a quiet analogy here with sleep itself. The mind before sleep often prefers not the loud and abrupt, but the interconnected. One thought leads to another through soft bridges. A castle leads to a wall, the wall to a road, the road to a village, the village to a field, the field to a weather pattern, the weather pattern to a season, and the season to a memory of old maps or old stories. The kingdom becomes a sequence of linked spaces, each one holding the next without hurry. This is why the subject can be so soothing. It allows the mind to wander in a structured way, like walking the outer edge of a fortress at dusk. Many fantasy worlds are built on the idea that the old places still matter, even when their original purpose is gone. A fortress may no longer defend against armies, but it can still guard tradition. A royal hall may no longer host kings, but it can still host ceremonies. A road may no longer be the busiest route in the land, but it still remembers the feet of travelers. Ancient sites in the real world often feel this way. They are no longer active centers of power, but they remain charged with meaning. A standing stone, a ruined wall, an old palace foundation, a mound under grass, all create that feeling that some earlier version of the world is still close by. In myths, this often becomes literal. A castle may be enchanted to sleep until a rightful heir returns. A kingdom may vanish beneath the sea. A tower may wait unchanged while generations pass. A forest may remember the names of long-dead rulers. These stories use time as something layered rather than linear. The past does not disappear. It settles, it rests. It can be touched again under the right conditions. That is an ancient and very human belief. It helps explain why ruined castles, buried cities, and forgotten capitals continue to fascinate us. They seem to hold time in place, if only briefly. The quiet history of fantasy worlds is also the history of how people made use of limits. Stone limited how large a wall could be, labor limited how quickly a fortress could rise, food limited how many people could stay within it, water limited where a city could grow. Yet from these limits came design. The gate was placed here, the well there, the granary here, the barracks there. A fortress is a solution to scarcity as much as to danger. Fantasy often presents castles as symbols of abundance, but they are also reminders that survival requires planning. The imagination may enjoy the grandeur of a banquet hall, but the structure underneath that feast is storage, transport, and careful accounting. In older kingdoms, the granary could be as important as the throne room, though it rarely gets the same attention in paintings. Grain meant stability, salt meant preservation, cold cellars meant endurance through winter. Herds meant mobility and wealth. These quiet resources shape the life of a realm more than dazzling events do. Fantasy sometimes hints at this through the language of harvest festivals, royal tithes, and village storehouses. A kingdom with full barns feels different from one in famine. Even in stories where magic exists, people still care deeply about winter. Perhaps that is one of the deepest truths fantasy keeps from history. The grand and the practical remain inseparable. The oldest myths of kingship often involve care for the land. A ruler who lets the kingdom fail becomes unworthy. A ruler who restores order is celebrated almost as if he or she were healing the weather itself. This connection between governance and landscape appears in many traditions. It is a gentle reminder that political power was once imagined not as abstraction, but as stewardship. Fantasy preserves this old feeling when it presents a kingdom as a living body. The castle is the head, the roads are arteries, the villages are organs, the forests are lungs, the rivers are veins. This metaphor is not unique to fantasy, but fantasy gives it shape in stone and soil. Even the names of places contribute to this atmosphere. Many fantasy settings use names that sound old because they are formed from old parts: hill, ford, keep, gate, wood, ham, borg, tun. Real place names often preserve the memory of earlier languages and forgotten uses. A town ending in Chester or Cester may trace back to a Roman fort. A place called something like ford or bridge may once have centered on a river crossing. These small linguistic fossils are everywhere in real geography. Fantasy names borrow this effect, making the listener feel that the map has been spoken over by many generations. The sounds themselves become a kind of archaeology, and archaeology is perhaps the quietest sibling of fantasy. It deals in fragments, foundations, potsherds, buried walls, ash layers, and the careful interpretation of what remains. It asks what a room might have been used for. It infers a feast from bones, a trade route from imported beads, a siege from arrowheads found in a ditch. Such work is patient, almost meditative. It values uncertainty without fear. Fantasy world-building often has the same quality when done gently. A heraldic crest is found on a broken shield. A forgotten inscription is copied into a scholar's notebook. A half-flooded tunnel suggests an older city beneath the present one. The world grows larger not through explanation alone, but through visible traces. Lost cities in particular have a special stillness. They exist at the border of fact and longing. Real lost cities have been buried by sand, swallowed by jungle, emptied by war, or abandoned as trade routes changed. Their rediscovery often feels like waking something that had been dreaming. Fantasy uses this feeling frequently. The lost city need not be full of treasure to be compelling. It may simply contain a court, a shrine, a watchtower, a marketplace, or a garden that no one has entered in centuries. The important part is that it persists in the imagination as a place where the past has not fully ended. There is comfort, too, in the thought that many great human structures were once ordinary decisions repeated many times. A wall was repaired because someone noticed a crack. A tower was added because the view from a lower one was insufficient. A district grew because artisans preferred to work near a water source. A castle chapel was expanded because the household wanted a more dignified place to pray. History is often a chain of modest choices. Fantasy, in its slow and thoughtful moments, reflects this by making kingdoms feel less like sudden inventions and more like accumulations. The realm exists because generations kept adding to it, as if placing one careful stone upon another. This is why the genre so often includes old family names, ancient vows, and hereditary responsibilities. They create continuity across change. A house rises, falls, returns, and declines again. A banner passes from hand to hand. A keep is inherited, besieged, rebuilt, and inherited once more. Real noble lineages were sometimes far messier than stories admit, but the emotional pattern remains useful. It gives the mind something to follow across time. It is a little like hearing an old melody returning after a long passage. The tune is familiar, but it comes back changed by what it has passed through. Fantasy also likes to place the kingdom in relation to something larger than itself. The sea, the wilderness, the mountain range, the empire beyond the horizon, the old magic under the soil, the sleeping god in the deep place, the ancestral dragon in the cave. These larger presences make the castle feel modest, and that modesty is part of its charm. A fortification against nothing is merely architecture. A fortification against the unknown becomes story. Ancient peoples often placed their cities in conversation with cosmic order, whether through stars, temple alignments, ritual calendars, or sacred geography. Fantasy continues that conversation with its own symbols, sometimes using constellations, omens, hidden maps, and prophetic ruins. At night, it is soothing to imagine that the kingdom is part of a wider, quiet world. The walls do not end reality, they simply frame one small portion of it. Beyond them, the moon moves over fields and forests, over road and river, over watchfires and sleeping roofs. Somewhere a horse shifts in its stall. Somewhere a bell tower marks the hour. Somewhere a tower window is dark, and somewhere else a lamp burns low in a scribe's room. These little details are enough to make the world feel complete without becoming loud. Fantasy thrives on such completeness. It does not need every detail to be explained. It only needs enough to suggest that if one listened longer, more would be there. This may be the deepest reason castles and kingdoms endure so strongly in fantasy. They organize attention. They take the vastness of history and make it inhabitably small. One can stand at the gate and know there is a yard inside, a hall beyond that, and a stair above. One can look beyond the wall and know there are fields, roads, farms, and farther still, other places with their own walls and memories. The world gains texture without becoming overwhelming. That is a lovely thing to carry into sleep, because sleep itself is also a kind of gentle narrowing. The world remains, but the edges soften. So let the kingdom continue to unfold in a low voice. Let the old road wind past a stone bridge and toward a market town where shutters are already closed. Let the town give way to orchards, then to pasture, then to a watchtower on a rise. Let the watchtower look east toward a river where morning mist gathers in pale layers. Let the river move under a broken arch from a much older age. Let the arch have once been Roman or older than Roman, or perhaps simply old enough that no one now remembers exactly who shaped it first. Let it remain anyway, because many things do. And beyond that river, let there be a hill with a fortress on it, not shining too brightly, not looming too harshly, but resting in the dark with the patient confidence of stone. Let there be a courtyard where ivy has found a seam. Let there be a hall where benches are stacked against the wall. Let there be a chapel with a single candle. Let there be a gatehouse where a guard leans on a spear and listens to the soft country night. Let the kingdom be neither perfect nor dangerous, but simply present, with its old customs and quiet distances. For fantasy has always been at its best when it treats power as something that sits within time rather than above it. A crown can be polished, but it still remembers the hands that wore it. A castle can be strengthened, but it still keeps its older stones. A kingdom can prosper, but it still depends on rain, harvest, and the good will of those who live far from the throne. These are modest truths, but they are durable ones. They make the imagined world feel stable enough to rest inside for a while. And if just before sleep you picture one more thing, let it be the oldest kind of kingdom, the kind built not only of walls and banners but of shared routines. A mill turning near a stream, a priest locking a shrine, a messenger changing horses, a child dropping seeds in a garden bed, a cook covering the embers, a mason laying down his tools, a woman drawing water from a well beside the outer road. These are the actions that keep a realm quietly alive. They do not ask to be remembered loudly, they only ask to continue. So the castle stands, and the keep and the kingdom around them. The roads grow dim, the fields cool, the old stones hold their last warmth from the day. The towers keep watch for no one in particular. The gates are shut, but not forever. The moon touches the battlements and slips away. Somewhere in a place half history and half dream, the kingdom remains patient and familiar, as if it had always been waiting for this exact soft hour, and as if it will continue waiting calmly until sleep arrives. And in that waiting, there is a long human habit, older than any single fortress, of looking for shape in the darkness. Long before fantasy kingdoms were imagined in books or painted onto maps, People had already begun to arrange the world into places that could be crossed, guarded, inherited, and remembered. A river was not just water. It was a boundary, a road, a source, a threat, a blessing. A hill was not only a hill, it was a vantage point, a burial place, a sacred height, a place where someone might someday build a wall. A cluster of houses was not merely shelter. It was a settlement, a kinship, a duty, a small promise that strangers would know one another by name. This is one reason the castles of fantasy feel so naturally connected to real history. They come from a deep instinct for shelter and order, but also from older layers of meaning. In some ancient places, walls were symbols before they were defenses. In Mesopotamian cities, great mud brick enclosures enclosed not only people, but a kind of civic identity. In Egypt, the immense stoneworks did not only protect or memorialize, they marked an idea of permanence against the drift of time. In the hill forts of Bronze Age Europe, in the earthen ramparts of the Iron Age, in the ring forts and citadels and high places of many regions, one sees the same quiet desire to stand slightly above the surrounding world, to create a center where life could gather and be known. Fantasy inherited this desire and made it legible in a single glance. A castle on a hill says at once that someone rules here, that the land around it belongs to a pattern, that there is a place where decision gathers before spreading outward. Yet the best fantasy castles also contain a softness that history often does not. They are not only military machines, they are homes, archives, banquet halls, chapels, kitchens, armories, sleeping chambers and stairwells that smell faintly of damp stone and beeswax. They are places where a child might hear footsteps echoing in a corridor and imagine the whole world stretched inside the walls. The real castles of history were often less romantic than the ones in stories, though they could be beautiful in their own practical way. They were noisy, crowded, and full of labor. Fires needed tending, roofs leaked, waste had to be carried away. Animals came and went. Smiths worked at the edge of the yard. Laundry dried on lines between towers. People lived there with their ordinary concerns, while the architecture itself tried to make sense of danger. Thick walls, narrow windows, arrow slits, gatehouses, portcullises, murder holes, all of these were answers to a world where a realm could be unsettled by a single siege. Yet even in their severity, castles became places of ceremony and memory. Their halls echoed with births, feasts, alliances, disputes, and farewells. Stone held more than battle, it held continuity. There is something quietly moving in that continuity. A castle can outlive the people who raised it, and then outlive the language in which they first named its rooms. It may become a ruin, then a landmark, then a story. In that slow change, it gathers layers of meaning. A crumbling keep on a lonely ridge may once have been a watchpoint for a border lord, then a shelter for shepherds, then a site visited by antiquarians, then a symbol in a novel. The stones remain, but their roles change like weather. Fantasy often catches this feeling very well. Its old towers are rarely just settings, they are memory made visible. Some of the oldest kingdoms in human history were not built in stone at all, at least not at first. They were networks of obligation, trade, ritual, and kinship that only later acquired monumental architecture. In early Sumer, in the lands between rivers, city, and kingdom, intertwined in ways that still feel faintly dreamlike now. Temples rose, written records appeared, and rulers became part administrative, part sacred, part mythic. In ancient Egypt, the concept of kingship itself was layered with divine association, and the land's long rhythm of flooding and planting gave the realm a pulse that was both agricultural and cosmological. In these ancient worlds, the kingdom was not merely territory, it was order, timing, and relationship. The king, when one existed, stood inside a larger system that included gods, calendars, tombs, canals, and the patient labor of many hands. Fantasy kingdoms often borrow this feeling of layered authority. Their rulers are not just political figures, they are keepers of tradition, heirs to prophecy, guardians of old stones, and sometimes only one part of a larger balance that includes the forest, the river, the mountain, the sea. A kingdom in fantasy may feel old because it seems to have grown around something deeper than itself. Maybe it stands over the ruins of a civilization that went quiet. Maybe its line of kings traces back to a heroic age. Maybe its legitimacy depends on a relic, a blessing, or a treaty with powers most people never see. These are not modern concerns, but they are ancient ones. They reach back to times when dynasties tried to anchor themselves in myth, and when myth in return made history feel inhabited. And so the quiet histories of fantasy worlds often include ruins, because ruins are among the most peaceful forms of storytelling. A ruin does not insist. It suggests. It lets imagination do the rest. A broken staircase implies footsteps that no longer sound. A collapsed gate suggests the size of the thing that once defended it. A fallen column points to a roof now gone. Grass growing through a floor tile tells of a room where people once sat, perhaps speaking softly, perhaps laughing, perhaps simply waiting for bread to bake. In the stillness of a ruin, the past feels close without becoming loud. Many ancient landscapes in the real world carry this feeling. A lone obelisk in a field, a standing stone on a hill, a fragment of wall beside a modern road, a temple platform with no temple remaining. Such places do not fully explain themselves, and that is part of their power. The same is true in fantasy when an old kingdom is only partly remembered. The names of its kings may survive in songs. The shape of its roads may remain beneath newer streets. Its old boundaries may still guide the placement of farms and towns. Its calendar may linger in festivals no one fully understands anymore. A well in the village square may be older than the village itself. A bridge may have been repaired many times, but still carry the curve of its first design. Even the words used for local hills, rivers, and gates may preserve traces of older tongues. Languages often do that. They keep old worlds alive in the smallest syllables. One of the most quiet pleasures in fantasy is to imagine a realm where every name has a history. Not because the history must be fully known, but because it exists. A castle called Greywatch may have been built to watch a border now long gone. A keep named for a saint may once have been a Roman fort. A kingdom's capital may rest where an older city once stood, its streets following ancient lines laid down when trade moved by cart and river barge. The place changes, and yet the shape remains. This is how continuity works most of the time, not through dramatic preservation, but through adaptation. One layer becomes the foundation for the next. In the ancient world, this layering was everywhere. Cities were often built atop older cities. Temples were rebuilt in the same sacred precincts. Burial mounds were raised near earlier burial mounds. Roads followed the easiest routes, which were often the routes used by people who had traveled there for centuries before maps existed. A traveler moving through such a landscape would not always know which age a wall belonged to. That uncertainty can be restful in fiction. It makes the world feel deep enough to exceed immediate understanding. Sleep often welcomes that feeling. Not ignorance exactly, but breadth. Fantasy also remembers that kingdoms are not made only of rulers and fortifications. They are made of agriculture, weather, and seasonal timing. The oldest empires knew this well. They lived by grain, by irrigation, by the predictable return of certain stars or rains or winds. A kingdom that cannot bring in the harvest is not a kingdom for long. So behind every grand hall there must be storehouses. Behind every knightly banner there must be granaries, shepherds, millers, and tax collectors. Behind every royal procession there must be road builders and stable hands. This practical foundation is often invisible in stories, yet it gives them weight. It reminds us that power, for all its ceremony, still rests on food. There is a gentle comfort in that truth, perhaps because it is so ordinary. The grandest fantasy castle still depends on someone baking bread before dawn. The most majestic throne room still depends on a staircase cleaned of dust. The most glittering kingdom still needs wells, cisterns, cistern workers, and people who know how to repair a roof before the rains begin. History is full of such quiet dependencies. In ancient Rome, The great reach of empire relied on roads, harbors, taxes, soldiers, legal habits, and the slow daily functioning of countless households. In China's many dynasties, the bureaucracy and record-keeping could become as significant as the palace itself. In the Maya world, city centers and ceremonial spaces were woven into broader networks of farming communities and sacred geography. In each case, magnificence was supported by routine. Fantasy often gives us the visible surface of that support in softened form: a market square with baskets of apples, a stable yard where horses stamp and breathe steam into morning air, a laundry courtyard, a baker's shop with a small window, a harbour where barrels are rolled across boards. These details matter because they make the world livable. They are the texture of existence between the dramatic moments. They are also the kinds of details the mind can rest on easily. One can imagine a lantern swinging over a cobbled lane, a fish market at dawn, a fountain in an inner courtyard, a scribe bending over a ledger, and feel the world settling around those images like a blanket. Many fantasy settings borrow from real medieval Europe, but they also often gather elements from much older and more varied civilizations. A kingdom may have an Egyptian-style tomb complex beyond the desert. It may have a river culture that recalls the Nile, the Euphrates, or the Indus. It may have sacred groves reminiscent of pre-Roman Europe or mountain monasteries like those in Tibet or the Himalayas. It may have zodiacal ceilings, stone circles, carved pillars, or massive terraced temples. The result is not a literal historical reconstruction, but a remembered collage, a tapestry of humanity's long fascination with sacred power and ordered space. This mixture is part of what makes fantasy feel ancient even when it is invented. It draws from many old wells. There is a particular calm in imagining that a kingdom has absorbed these influences slowly over centuries. Perhaps its central fortress began as a hill sanctuary, then became a watch post, then a lord's seat, then a royal residence. Perhaps its legal customs grew from tribal assemblies, then feudal obligations, then written charters, each layer never entirely erased by the next. Perhaps its myths changed when new peoples arrived, yet the old gods survived under new names, as often happened in the real world. Human belief tends to be patient. It accumulates. A sacred spring may remain sacred even after the language of its prayers changes. A mountain may carry a new legend without losing the old sense of reverence. A kingdom in fantasy often feels believable when it remembers this kind of accumulation. And sometimes what lingers most is not the grand event but the small object: an old key, a signet ring, a carved lintel, a boundary stone, a bronze mirror, a mosaic fragment, a chipped seal on a clay tablet, a tapestry repaired in several places. Such things appear in ancient archives and museum cases, but they also inhabit fantasy with an almost dreamlike quietness. They imply systems of meaning, the existence of people who knew how to use them, and the fact that those people are now gone. A signet ring suggests authority and habit. A key suggests a room and a duty. A tablet suggests a hand pressing symbols into soft clay, then letting the sun harden them into record. A tapestry suggests long evenings and the desire to keep images warm inside a home. These objects are small, but they are enough to summon worlds. One could say the same of maps. The map of a kingdom is a kind of bedtime object in itself. A good fantasy map invites the eye to wander without urgency. It shows mountains, coasts, forests, roads, and names that sound like places where stories have already happened and may happen again. Yet the map is also an old human tool. Ancient surveyors, astronomers, navigators, and scribes all tried to make the world drawable. Babylonian maps, Roman itineraries, Ptolemaic geography, Chinese cartography, Polynesian star paths, Arab navigational traditions, and countless local traditions each found their own way to represent distance and relation. A fantasy map inherits all of this as atmosphere. It gives the feeling that the land has shape, that it can be understood from above even if no one can see all of it at once. This is part of why kingdoms are so soothing in fantasy. They imply knowable borders, not rigid certainty but a comforting degree of structure. There is the northern march, the river province, the southern coast, the old forest, the capital, the frontier, the road to the monastery, the pass into the neighboring realm. One can imagine days of travel between them, but the distances are not endless. They are traversable. A messenger can ride them, a caravan can cross them, a pilgrim can walk them. The kingdom has edges, and because it has edges, it can be held in the mind. The mind, especially before sleep, likes to know what belongs where. Yet even the best-known kingdoms in fantasy usually contain something beyond their own order: a wilderness, a haunted wood, a sea with uncharted islands, a mountain range where old gods may still dwell, a marsh where no one builds roads, a desert with buried cities. This contrast matters because a kingdom without mystery would become flat. Ancient civilizations knew this too. The mapped world was always surrounded by the less known, by regions that were reported, feared, traded with, mythologized, or simply left blank. Greek writers imagined edges of the world where strange peoples lived. Chinese histories recorded distant lands with a mix of precision and wonder. Indian epics stretched across landscapes both earthly and mythic. Norse sagas placed human settlements beside a world populated by giants, hidden beings, and the pull of fate. Human geography has always held both the seen and the half-seen. Fantasy keeps that balance gently. It gives enough order to feel safe, and enough mystery to keep the imagination awake in a soft, wandering way. A kingdom might have a census, a court, and a code of laws, yet still be ringed by a forest where old paths vanish. A castle might have disciplined guards and strict schedules, yet still house a forgotten staircase that leads to a sealed chamber. A monastery may copy manuscripts by candlelight, but the books themselves may preserve names no one understands. This layered uncertainty is not frightening when handled with care. It is restful because it allows the mind to drift without losing its bearings. Some of the oldest surviving kingdoms in memory are those preserved by story rather than archaeology. Troy, for instance, occupies a strange place between myth and history. Even when the precise shape of the city is debated, the idea of Troy remains powerful because it sits at the meeting point of epic, memory, and ruin. Camelot too belongs more to literary longing than fixed geography, and yet it feels vivid because it gathers into one place so many wishes about just rule, fellowship, and decline. The kingdom of Arthur is less a political entity than a mood of nobility touched by loss. In such stories, the castle is not only architecture, it is an ideal, and perhaps that is why it lingers. Fantasy often does this with its own invented realms. It creates places that are not entirely meant to be found on a map of the real world, but on a map of longing. A kingdom at the edge of the sea, a citadel in the high country, a green valley hidden between old hills, a city of towers built around an ancient lake, a realm under winter's long spell, a land where every village keeps a shrine to the first king, a place where the royal line is said to descend from a star or a wolf or a goddess in disguise. These are imaginative structures, yet they echo a very old human appetite for origin stories. People have always wanted to know where order came from. In ancient myth, kingship was often brought from heaven, or from the gods, or from a legendary ancestor. The Sumerian king list, with its mix of impossibly long reigns and historical memory, suggests how power and myth can braid together. Egyptian pharaohs tied themselves to cosmic order. In Japan, imperial continuity was linked to divine descent. In many societies, rulers were understood through sacred narrative, even when their actual governance was complex and human. Fantasy borrows this because it knows that a crown feels different when it is not merely chosen, but inherited from a story. Even if the story is contested, it gives the realm depth. And the deep history of fantasy worlds is not only about rulers, it is also about how ordinary people make meaning within systems they did not create. A farmer may not know the royal genealogy, but he knows the season when the river rises. A potter may not care about the border dispute, but she knows where the clay is good. A fisher may not attend court, but he knows the names of the currents and the weather signs. In fantasy, the kingdom becomes believable when these local knowledges are allowed to exist. The map of power is always overlaid on the map of life. The two are related but not identical. This may be why some of the most memorable fantasy settings feel as if they have villages, forests, and old roads that predate the castle. The castle arrives later, usually. It grows from the place or imposes itself on it, but it does not erase what came before. Beneath the paved courtyard there may be older foundations. Beneath the chapel there may be a shrine older still. Beneath the keep there may be a well dug into the first settlement. Beneath the realm there may be an even older pattern of migration and exchange. Real landscapes are like that. They carry human decisions in layers. A market town may have originated at a ford. A capital may have been chosen because of water, terrain, or trade routes. A sacred centre may remain where a hill, spring, or grove gave it special significance long before the first stone wall was raised. The quietest histories are often the most durable. A road used for centuries, a boundary remembered in family stories, a river ferry replaced by a bridge, then by a modern crossing, yet still spoken of by the old name of the ford, a castle that became a manor house, then a ruin, then a conservation site. A kingdom that became a nation, a province, a legend, or a holiday in the calendar. Time does not always erase. Sometimes it softens, repurposes, and folds the old into the new. Fantasy understands this in a particularly tender way. It knows that nothing must disappear completely for the world to feel enchanted. Even loss can be gentle when it is framed as continuity. There is also the matter of quiet law. Not the dramatic law of trials and rebellions, but the everyday law that allows a kingdom to hold together. Measure, weights, tolls, inheritance, marriage, land tenure, oaths, guild rules, monastic customs, customs at bridges and ports, seasonal obligations to the manor or crown. Much of history is made of such things. The grand events that later become stories usually rise on a foundation of administrative repetition. Fantasy may not linger on these details, but their presence in the background makes a realm feel real. A kingdom with no taxes, no records, no courts, no local customs, and no sense of precedent often feels weightless. A kingdom with a little bureaucracy, even in simplified form, begins to breathe. The same can be said of religion in fantasy worlds. It is often present not as doctrine but as atmosphere. A shrine beside the road, a saint's day, a bell at dusk, a temple with a quiet fire. A priest who blesses the fields, an old goddess remembered in the names of springs and stars. Ancient civilizations understood religion not merely as belief, but as a woven part of life. Offerings, calendars, burial rites, vows, omens, and festivals were all linked to the maintenance of cosmic and civic order. In fantasy, this often becomes a gentle backdrop of ritual rather than a system of argument. That is fitting for bedtime, because it gives the impression of a world where life has rhythms beyond the immediate moment. Some fantasy kingdoms feel especially old because they contain tombs. Tombs are among the most serene structures ever made by human hands. They are built to hold absence with dignity. A burial chamber, a cairn, a mausoleum, a necropolis, a temple grave, all of these say that the dead remain part of the landscape. Ancient Egypt left some of the most famous examples, but tomb architecture appears across many times and cultures, from the royal mounds of Scandinavia to the painted chambers of Etruria, from the tumuli of steppe peoples to the rock-cut tombs of Anatolia and beyond. In fantasy, a royal tomb deep beneath a castle or a forgotten crypt beneath a cathedral gives the kingdom a sense of depth that reaches below the living present. It suggests that rule is not only a matter of today. It is a long conversation with the dead. That is a strangely comforting thought when encountered slowly. It reminds us that every inhabited place carries other inhabitants in memory. Beneath the floorboards there may be earlier floors. Beneath the town square there may have been a market in another age. Beneath the castle there may have been a burial mound or a sacred chamber. One need not imagine these things with fear. They can simply exist as part of the layered quiet of the world. Fantasy often does this with a soft hand. The old dead are not always threatening. Sometimes they are watchful, patient, or merely present. They lend gravity without becoming noise. And then there are the keepers of memory. Scribes, monks, archivists, chroniclers, librarians, mapmakers, singers, and storytellers. Any kingdom that wishes to continue beyond one generation must somehow remember itself. Ancient libraries have vanished, but the idea of them has not. We think of Alexandria, of clay tablet collections, of imperial archives, of monastery scriptoria, of court records, of genealogies memorized and recited. Each civilization found different ways to resist forgetting. Fantasy often places such memory in a tower, a vault, a great hall of books, or a secluded abbey. These places are quiet in the best sense. They contain not just information, but time held still in pages, scrolls, and annotations. There is a certain bedtime beauty in imagining a chronicler at work while the rest of the castle sleeps. A small lamp, a reed pen, a stack of documents, a ledger of harvests and disputes, a book of lineages, a map with notations in the margin. The chronicler does not need to be famous. In fact, it is often better if they are not. They are simply the person who keeps the realm intelligible to itself. In real history, we know so much of the past because someone copied, preserved, and translated. Without those humble acts, whole centuries would be quieter still. Fantasy honors this by filling its libraries with old names, lost alphabets, and books that feel heavier than their binding. A castle library in a fantasy story is rarely just a room. It is a chamber of accumulated gravity. Shelves may rise to a high window, dust may float in the angled light, a ladder may roll on iron wheels. There may be atlases, bestiaries, saintly lives, genealogies, battle accounts, astrological charts, herbals, chronicles, and half-deciphered texts from a civilization that vanished before the present kingdom was founded. The room itself becomes a small model of the larger world, layered, careful, and a little mysterious. It invites curiosity without urgency. That may be why so many readers and listeners find such places comforting. They imply that knowledge exists, but it does not all need to be consumed at once. This also connects to the way fantasy often treats age. Older is not always wiser, but older is often thicker with meaning. An ancient tree, an old bridge, a weathered gate, a stone stair worn into a smooth curve by centuries of feet. These are objects that seem to have accepted time instead of resisting it. Ancient cities, too, can have this quality. Some streets in modern places still follow lines set long ago, and some neighborhoods feel haunted by the shapes of earlier centuries, even when nothing visibly remains. A fantasy kingdom that feels old in the right way is one where age has become part of the scenery, not a problem to be solved. The buildings know they are old. The people know they are living among layers. The world does not apologize for its age. It simply continues. And because it continues, it can be inhabited by many kinds of quiet life. A gardener in an inner courtyard clipping herbs, a stable boy brushing a mare's coat, a seamstress mending a banner, a cook tasting stew in a copper spoon, a watchman on a stair landing listening to rain, a queen or king reading by a window while dusk gathers, a messenger warming hands near a brazier, a child tracing the outline of a kingdom on a map and asking what lies beyond the mountains. These are not small things in fantasy. They are the texture that makes grandeur inhabitable. Even the most famous legendary castles often gain their emotional power from this mixture of scale and intimacy. A great hall can be vast, but it matters because someone there waits for a letter. A banquet can be splendid, but it lingers in memory because a cup was raised in friendship. A tower can seem unreachable, but it becomes familiar when a single lamp is seen in its upper room night after night. Human beings do not truly live in architecture alone. They live in habits. A kingdom is a pattern of repeated days. Fantasy knows this and, at its best, preserves the pattern softly rather than loudly. There is also the curious fact that castles and kingdoms often feel most evocative when they are slightly incomplete. Not every room is mapped, not every dynasty is explained, not every custom is translated. This incompleteness mirrors real history, which is never fully recoverable. Much of the past survives as shards, inscriptions, foundations, coins, rumors, and reconstructions. Archaeology is often the art of patient uncertainty. One piece suggests another. A wall suggests a courtyard. A buried road suggests a gate. A seal impression suggests an office. A bead, a pot, a bone, a tile, a flake of pigment, all of these can open a whole world in the mind. Fantasy captures this archaeology of imagination by letting whole realms be inferred from a few carefully chosen details. A single banner can do a great deal. A silver stag on blue cloth, a black tower on white, a crown above a green hill, an amber sun, a ship, a dragon, a red knot. Heraldry in fantasy often feels old because it condenses identity into symbol. Real heraldry did the same. Arms marked alliances, lineages, claims, and memories. They turned social complexity into visible form. A knight's shield became a small portable kingdom of meaning. Even now, flags and emblems continue the practice. They let communities identify themselves at a glance, and in fantasy, that glance is often enough to make a realm feel coherent. The eye sees the symbol and the mind supplies the history. Some kingdoms in fantasy are made memorable by the texture of their weather. A foggy river kingdom, a sunlit coast, a highland realm of sudden storms, a winter kingdom of ice and dark pine, a desert kingdom of gold dust and cool courtyards. Climate shapes architecture, travel, clothing, storage, agriculture, and social rhythm. Ancient cities were similarly formed by their climates. Mud brick in one place, stone in another, raised floors where floods came, thick walls where heat pressed down, roof shapes adapted to snow or rain or wind. Fantasy feels especially lived in when these practical adaptations are quietly visible. A courtyard shaded with cloth, a cistern in a dry land, a steep roof under snow, a harbour with windbreaks. These details are not flashy, but they are part of the deep comfort of a believable world. And because belief grows from repetition, the kingdom in fantasy often has a set of recurring places: the gate, the market, the chapel, the armory, the kitchen, the hall, the archive, the stable, the tower, the outer wall, the inner court, the road leading away from the city, the bridge over the water. Each place has a purpose, and each purpose anchors a different kind of attention. The gate is where arrival and departure meet. The market is where the realm feeds itself. The chapel is where the kingdom remembers the unseen. The armory is where the realm prepares to defend itself. The archive is where it remembers itself. The stable is where movement begins. The tower is where someone watches. In a good fantasy world, these spaces are never only backdrop. They are the quiet machinery of continuity. Perhaps that is why bedtime and castles belong together so naturally. Both are structures of safe enclosure. Both create an inside and an outside. Both allow the mind to rest within boundaries while sensing that more exists beyond them. At night, the house becomes a castle of sorts, with doors locked, lamps dimmed, and familiar rooms turned gentle by shadow. The world beyond may be full of motion, but within the walls, things settle into hush. Fantasy takes this domestic feeling and expands it into realm and keep and kingdom, yet the emotional shape remains the same. There is a place to be. There is a door that closes. There is a watch kept somewhere beyond hearing. There is enough, and in that enoughness the oldest histories come to rest. The limestone cities, the mud brick walls, the hill forts, the citadels, the temple precincts, the palaces, the tombs, the roads, the boundary stones, the old words for river and gate and hill. All of them are part of humanity's long effort to make place meaningful. Fantasy does not replace that effort. It echoes it very softly. It says that the world can be arranged into rooms of understanding, and that within those rooms there may be kings and keepers, bells and banners, wells and windows, gardens and archives, all waiting in a patient order that does not need to be rushed. So let the kingdom grow quieter now. Let the last light slip from the battlements. Let the watchfire burn low. Let the courtyard fountain continue its small sound in the dark. Let the old banner rest against the stone. Let the horses settle in the stable. Let the kitchen embers fade to red dots beneath ash. Let the scribe close the ledger. Let the steward set down the key. Let the priest or sage or gardener finish the final round and return indoors. Let the roads beyond the wall be empty for a while. Let the river carry moonlight in a narrow silver line. Let the mountains keep their silence. And if the imagination wanders one step farther, let it find not a battle, but an archive beneath the castle, not a vault of treasure, but a room of records, not a hidden enemy, but a row of boxes tied with faded cord. In one box there is a map of the old borders, in another a list of harvests, in another names of places that no longer appear on any current sign, in another a letter written by someone whose hand is long gone, describing a spring thaw or a coronation, or the first day of spring at the edge of the kingdom. These fragments are enough. They make the world feel inhabited by many lives, all of them now softened by time. This is one of the tender truths of fantasy worlds. They do not need to be complete to feel real. They need only suggest continuity. A few old stones, a river crossing, a tower, a name remembered, a road used for generations, a chapel candle, a family crest, a rumor about the first king, a song about the lost city, a legend of a queen who walked in disguise, a bridge that no one remembers building, enough to imply that the world stretches backward as well as outward. Enough to let the mind rest inside its edges. The oldest civilizations knew this too in their own way. A city was not merely a place to live, it was a pattern between earth and memory. A temple was not merely a building. It was a point where human time touched something larger. A king was not merely a person, he was, for better or worse, an emblem of continuity. And a kingdom, whether historical or imagined, was not only territory but an arrangement of belonging. Fantasy keeps these meanings close, then wraps them in stone, banner, candlelight, and old song. It lets the deep past become a place one can visit with the imagination and then leave gently when sleep comes. So now the castle need do no more than stand. The keep need do no more than keep. The kingdom need do no more than breathe in its sleep of fields and stone and darkened roads. The old names may remain on the map. The gate may remain barred. The wells may remain full. The orchards may wait for morning. The archives may wait for another hand. The ravens may settle on the towers, then fold themselves into the night. The moon moves slowly above all of it, as it has above so many realms, real and unreal, for so many quiet centuries. And beneath that moon there is no need to hurry. The kingdom is whole enough for this hour. Its walls are old enough to hold their shape. Its stories are deep enough to continue without being told all at once. Its roads are long enough to lead somewhere tomorrow. Its towers are calm against the dark. Its people, near and far, sleep under roofs of their own. The river keeps moving. The stones keep their silence. The history remains not as a demand but as a gentle presence. And in that presence the imagined world grows softer, dimmer, and more distant, until at last it is only a calm outline, a patient kingdom, waiting at the edge of dream. And yet, even as the kingdom becomes quiet, there is a kind of life still moving through it, very slowly, very ordinarily, in ways that rarely appear on a map. A pot of barley softens in a kitchen near the outer wall. A lantern is set beside a stair to keep one corner from becoming too dark. A page in a ledger is turned. A pair of gloves dries near a hearth. A cartwheel abandoned in a yard holds a small crescent of rainwater. In the morning, someone will mend a hinge, sweep a threshold, carry a basket of turnips, or refill a clay jug from the well. These small acts are the true ballast of a kingdom. They are the things that keep its imagined grandeur from floating away. In many old societies, it was the everyday that made the sacred possible. Grain had to be measured before it could be offered. Stones had to be cut before they could be arranged in a temple wall. Roads had to be kept clear for processions, merchants, messengers, and pilgrims. The grandeur of a palace depended on the steady labor of people who never stood in the center of the hall. The same is true in fantasy, where the tallest tower still relies on the mason, The carpenter, the cook, the brewer, the groom, the washer of linens, the repairer of shutters, the child carrying a tray too carefully through the corridor. A world feels deepest when it seems to contain this invisible work, this patient maintenance of ordinary things. And perhaps that is one reason castles feel so absorbing. They are not merely symbols of power, they are houses of many layers. Below the hall may be storage, then kitchens, then cellars, then passages, then foundations sunk into older stone. In the walls may be stairs so narrow that two people cannot pass. In the yards may be herb beds, tool sheds, coops, barrel racks, smithing corners, stacked firewood and rain barrels dark with reflected sky. To imagine a castle well is to imagine the quiet logistics of survival. Water must be carried, bread must be baked, doors must be barred, oil must be stored. Torches must be made. A great keep is only as steady as the smallest details that support it. This practical side of fortress life has a gentleness to it when observed from a distance. It is not only about defense, it is also about rhythm. At dawn a gate opens. At noon a horn calls people to a shared meal. At dusk shutters close one by one. The stable hand checks the tack. The steward counts the salt. The gardener inspects the bean rows against the wall where warmth lingers a little longer. The watchman listens to the wind from the parapet and knows it well enough to distinguish it from footsteps. In a fantasy kingdom, such routines can feel almost medicinal in their calmness. They suggest a world that has not forgotten how to repeat itself, which is one of the oldest ways of enduring time. Ancient cities understood repetition too. The same roads were swept. The same offerings were made. The same stars rose over the same terraces and riverbanks. A civilization becomes legible through what it repeats as much as through what it builds. In Mesopotamia, temple complexes gathered layers of use and rebuilding, one period resting upon another like older sleep beneath newer sleep. In Egypt, the long continuity of kingship made monuments feel less like isolated acts and more like sentences in a very long text. Mesoamerica, sacred architecture aligned with celestial cycles, so that stone and sky appeared to keep a shared calendar. Fantasy kingdoms often borrow that feeling of accumulated time. Their castles are not fresh constructions, but descendants of earlier fortresses, older halls, ruined gatehouses, and foundations laid by forgotten hands. It is comforting to think that every stone might have a predecessor. The battlement may stand where a wooden palisade once stood. The chapel may have replaced a grove. The tower may have been raised atop a hill once marked by a beacon fire. A modern fantasy kingdom may not say all of this aloud, but it can imply it. And the implication is enough. It allows the mind to rest among layers without needing to count them. One can simply feel the depth. One can imagine a wall built over older walls, a road laid over older trackways, a city gate echoing an even older gate that opened onto a different age with different names. There is a special quietness in thinking about lost names. So many kingdoms in myth and history are remembered only indirectly. A river keeps the echo of a people who named it first. A ruin keeps a shape after the language of its builders is gone. A legend preserves a kingdom in fragments, as if memory itself had been worn smooth by centuries. Fantasy often works in this same tender register. It presents us with cities whose original purpose is lost, lineages whose first founder is half remembered, and relics whose inscriptions can no longer be read. The mystery does not need resolution to be satisfying. Sometimes the incomplete thing is the most restful thing of all. The mind can drift around it like a small boat around a foggy island. And what is a kingdom, in the end, if not a shared act of remembering? Borders may be drawn on maps, but the feeling of a realm often lives in stories. Children hear the old names before they know the roads. Apprentices learn the shape of the city before they learn the balance of the accounts. Travelers carry impressions from town to town, describing where the river widens, where the road becomes muddy, where the hill shows the first view of the towers. Through all of this, the kingdom becomes more than geography. It becomes a mental landscape, built from remembered weather, local customs, market days, feast days, toll gates, chapel bells, and the simple knowledge that beyond one ridge lies another valley with another village and another small life unfolding. In fantasy, this sense of life continuing beyond the frame is especially rich. The story may stay within the castle for a while, but the world quietly extends outward. There are farms where the barley is ripe. There are forest clearings where berry pickers know which paths are safe after rain. There are river ferries, shrine steps, border posts, old stone milestones with moss in their grooves, and shepherd routes marked by memory rather than by sign. There may be a monastery on a cold hill where someone copies texts by candlelight. There may be a harbour where ropes creak against pilings and the salt air ages the wood. There may be a market town whose bells mark the hour in a voice that travels over rooftops and into open fields. The castle is only one note in a larger chord, but because it sounds a little more clearly, the whole harmony can be felt. Some of the loveliest fantasy histories are shaped by what they choose not to explain. A corridor may have no stated builder. A ruined stair may lead nowhere, and that may be enough. A family banner may show a beast no one has seen in a century. A king may keep a locked room containing objects from a campaign no one wants to discuss. An old crown may be described only as heavy, dark, and cold to the touch. These details create a space that feels inhabited by memory without overfilling it. They also echo the way real history often feels. Historians assemble what they can from surviving traces, but large stretches of the past remain partial, interpretive, and quiet. The silence is part of the knowledge. There are old cities whose buried layers have to be guessed at from foundations, shards, soil changes, and weathered walls. There are inscriptions that can be read only in part. There are kings known from a single broken tablet, or a seal impression, or a foreign chronicle. There are roads that seem to vanish into fields, only to reappear far away. There are fortresses where the original shape is visible only in the plan of the stones. This kind of fragmentary understanding has a very fantasy-like beauty. It reminds us that the past is not a museum display all arranged at once. It is a careful reconstruction made from echoes. A kingdom in a bedtime story feels deeper when it, too, is partly reconstructed from whispers. And then there are the myths that settle naturally into castles and keeps, as though they had always belonged there. A tower with a sealed room may remind us of older stories about forbidden chambers. A hidden door may echo tales of underworld passages, secret rites, or divine tests. A throne room may feel like a place where fate gathers slowly, not because a wizard has cast a spell over it, but because generations have sat under the same beams, listening to the same kind of petition. A well in a courtyard may seem ordinary, and then suddenly ancient if one remembers how often wells in old stories are places of memory, encounter, omen, and depth. Water from the ground has always felt a little more mysterious than water carried by hand. The quiet myths of building are especially enduring. A city founded on a hill, a fortress placed where two rivers meet, a kingdom established where a road crosses a ford. These practical sites become enchanted by use, then re-enchanted by story. People begin to say the hill was chosen by the gods, the rivers by a prophecy, the ford by a sign in the clouds. Even if the first reason was simply convenience or defense, the later stories make the place feel as if it had been waiting for meaning all along. Fantasy embraces this beautifully. It lets practical geography and sacred resonance sit side by side, as they often do in the human imagination. The world need not choose between them. A castle in the evening is one of the most peaceful images imaginable. Smoke rises in a thin vertical line. A curtain moves slightly at a high window. The banners hang still. A dog curls beside the outer kitchen door. A lantern on the wall makes a bright oval on the stone. Somewhere a bell is rung only once, not for alarm, but to mark the hour. The sound travels across the yard and softens in the outer courts. Then it is gone. This is not a scene of suspense. It is a scene of settling. It says that enough has been done for today. The gates are checked, the meals are counted, The horses are watered, the watch is set. What remains now is only the patient work of night. In many historical kingdoms, nightlife was far quieter than modern minds sometimes imagine. Light was precious, movement slowed, streets darkened, rooms were shared close to fire. The sounds that remained were often domestic ones: the crackle of coals, a latch turned, a cough from another bedchamber, a pot set down carefully, a board creaking in the rafters. In fantasy, these sounds can become part of the atmosphere of safety. The castle is not only a seat of authority, it is a shelter against weather, darkness, and uncertainty. Even when danger exists in the wider world, the nightly routine of closing and listening and resting is its own form of peace. There is a noble sort of loneliness in old stone, not sadness exactly, but spaciousness. A hall at midnight can seem so large that it becomes almost abstract, reduced to columns of shadow and a few lit patches on the floor. The people who walk there by day are gone to sleep. Their voices have thinned into memory. The stone remains cool and patient. In fantasy stories, this spaciousness often invites thought about ancestry. Who sat at the high table? Who first carved the lintel? Who climbed those stairs with a letter that changed the course of a line of succession? Who looked out from the tower window during winter and watched the snow soften the outer yard? The questions drift softly without demanding answers, and that gentle uncertainty is part of their charm. The same charm appears in ruins: a broken arch, a fallen wall, a stair ending in grass, a well stone filled with leaves, a carved face worn nearly smooth by rain. Ruins invite the imagination to finish them. Yet they also ask us to accept their incompleteness. In many ancient places, decay is not a failure but a phase. The stones return to weather. Plants move into mortar cracks. Birds nest where banners once hung. The work of time continues without drama. Fantasy ruins carry this same dignity. They do not need to be haunted to be meaningful. They can simply be old, and that oldness can feel as if it contains more hours than a person could ever count. And what of kingdoms that are not fallen, but simply old? Those are perhaps the most restful of all. Their pages are worn but not torn. Their customs have settled like fine dust into the folds of daily life. Their roads are known. Their market days are regular. Their borders are guarded not from panic, but from habit and care. A kingdom at ease has a special softness to it. It may still have history, rivalry, ambition, and memory, but these are all held within a wider confidence that tomorrow will arrive in a shape already partly understood. This is a comforting fantasy because it mirrors the wish for continuity. One wants the world to remain legible. One wants the same mountains to be there in the morning. One wants the river to keep its course. Fantasy can make this wish feel almost architectural. A strong kingdom is often imagined through stability of form: a keep that stands, a wall that holds, a road that connects, a harbour that shelters, a clock tower that marks time, a library that preserves names, a granary that sees people through winter. These structures express a civilization's hopes without speaking. Their presence says that someone planned for more than the present hour. Someone expected next season. Someone believed that continuity mattered. That belief is deeply soothing. It tells the mind that the world is not only a series of surprises, but also a place where ordinary expectations can survive. There are old empires whose legacy is felt in roads, laws, aqueducts, fortifications, and written traditions long after their political power has gone. That lingering afterlife is one of the quiet wonders of history. A kingdom may end, but its influence can remain like a faint fragrance in stone. Fantasy often borrows from this persistence. A vanished people may still shape the present through architecture, ritual, language, or relics. A ruined citadel may be built from blocks taken from an older sacred site. A current dynasty may claim descent from a line that has become more legend than record. These layers create depth without noise. They let the past remain active without requiring it to be loud. It is also interesting how often fantasy kingdoms depend on the shape of the land itself. Mountains create borders. Rivers carry trade and memory. Forests create concealment but also roots, traditions, and respect. Marshes keep secrets. Deserts preserve bones, tablets, and fragments under dry air. Snowfields silence footsteps. Cliffs make watchfulness necessary. Caves suggest underworlds, refuges, and hidden pathways. Even the weather begins to feel like a political force. A long winter changes allegiance more effectively than a speech. A spring flood can redraw the margin of a realm. A drought can empty a town without a sword ever being drawn. The land is never merely background. It is a participant in the life of the kingdom. Ancient farmers knew this with intimate patience. They watched seasons not as abstractions, but as calendars of survival. They read clouds, soil, wind, bird movement, and frost. Their kingdoms were shaped as much by harvest as by coronation. Fantasy worlds that remember this feel especially grounded. The castle may shine in the moonlight, but the granary matters. The banquet hall may be grand, but the orchard matters. The knight may ride in shining mail, but the mill wheel matters too. A kingdom is fed by the patient turning of many small, repeatable things, and sleep comes more easily when the mind is allowed to imagine that steadiness. There is a special sort of nostalgia in imagining a kingdom before the storm, not because the storm must arrive, but because the quiet before it has its own completeness. The watch changes, the candles are trimmed, the salt cellar is filled, the hearth is stoked, a corridor is swept, a letter is folded, a roof beam settles in the cold. The castle continues to be a place where many small human intentions meet the wider world. This is perhaps why it feels so reassuring. It makes civilization feel tangible, as something made of hands and habits rather than abstractions. It offers a sense that order can be local, practical, and modest. And if there is magic in such a kingdom, it is often most beautiful when it is woven into routine. A herb garden where rosemary is planted beside the kitchen door because it keeps the air sharp and clean. A lantern glass etched with old symbols that cast star shapes on the floor. A book in the library that can only be opened at dawn, not because of spectacle, but because the light is right. A chapel where the candles are lit in a pattern that echoes a constellation. A well where wishes are made in silence. A wall stone warm from the day's sun even after the air has cooled. This kind of magic does not shout. It joins the ordinary. It treats everyday life as worthy of enchantment. Myths often imagine that the oldest powers lived near places like these. Wells, crossroads, thresholds, orchards, bridges, and hearths, not always in thunder and revelation, but in the felt nearness of things that mark transitions. A castle contains many thresholds: gate to yard, yard to hall, hall to stair, stair to chamber, chamber to bed, bed to dream. Each threshold is a small ceremony of passage. To move through such spaces is to enact the life of the kingdom in miniature. You come in from the road, you are announced, you are fed, you wait, you rest, you depart. Fantasy understands how profound this can be, and how soothing it is to imagine a world where passages are recognized and honored. Some kingdoms in stories endure because they are remembered by their libraries as much as by their battle standards. A scriptorium can be as important as a keep. A shelf of chronicles can outlast a dynasty. A map room can preserve borders that no longer exist in practice but still matter in memory. There is a special quiet in books housed within stone. They seem to belong to the slow hours. Their pages record treaties, genealogies, weather reports, feast schedules, saints' lives, trade tallies, and the names of villages that may no longer be inhabited. Such records are not glamorous, but they are deeply human. They show the urge to keep continuity against forgetting. In a fantasy kingdom, that urge becomes part of the atmosphere itself, and so the castle archive, imagined earlier, can now become larger in the mind. Not a dramatic chamber, but a series of rooms where the air smells faintly of wax, dust, leather, and old paper. Shelves of ledgers, bundles of letters, wax seals in broken bowls, inventory lists written in careful lines, a missing page from a charter, a register of births and marriages, a jar of spare keys, a drawer of obsolete coins, a map rolled and tied with string. Some records survive in splendid order, some are water-stained, some are only fragments. Yet even these fragments make the kingdom feel real. They imply that people once believed tomorrow would need to know what today had done. This is one of the loveliest gifts of old history to fantasy, the sense that the past is not dead but folded. It lies beneath the present like another cloth layer under a table setting. Sometimes it shows through. A street follows the line of an ancient wall. A palace stands on earlier foundations. A shrine occupies a place that has been sacred for centuries under different names. A local festival preserves an older agricultural rite in softened form. In an imaginary kingdom, these continuities make the world feel inhabited by long memory. They also make it feel gentle. If the past can survive in small ways, perhaps the present can too. The idea of a keep is itself soothing because it suggests retention, shelter, and care. A keep keeps. It holds what must be held. It protects people, records, provisions, or traditions. It may stand at the center of a castle, but the word carries a larger emotional meaning. It implies that some things are meant to remain. Not everything, of course. History changes. Seasons turn, dynasties end. But certain forms of continuity endure. Family stories told by the hearth, communal feasts, the custom of ringing a bell at dusk, the annual blessing of fields, the old names of hills and streams. These are the quiet keeps of civilization. They are how a world remembers itself without strain. If one imagines the kingdom from very far away, it can look almost like a constellation of lights in a dark landscape. One light for the castle, one for the village chapel, one for the mill, one for the watchtower on the ridge, one for the monastery lamp, one for the inn by the road, one for the harbour beacon, one for the farmstead window under the hill. The rest is darkness, but not empty darkness. It is land, weather, forest, river, field, and distance. Fantasy gives the mind permission to feel that distance and still trust that the lights belong to one connected world. That trust is comforting. It lets us rest inside a larger shape. The oldest myths often gave kingdoms such shapes by linking them to cosmic order. A ruler might be tied to the sun, the stars, the seasons, or the health of the land. A city might be founded according to an auspicious alignment. A mountain might serve as an axis between earthly and divine realms. In such stories, political life, sacred life, and natural life are braided together. Fantasy continues this braid, though more softly. The throne may sit beneath carved constellations. The harvest may depend on an old blessing. The castle chapel may face the dawn. Even if the magic is never shown directly, the arrangement itself suggests that the kingdom lives within a meaningful universe. That sense of meaning is part of why these stories can be restful. They do not insist that the world is perfectly safe. They simply imply that the world is intelligible enough to be inhabited. A road leads somewhere. A map can be read. A lineage can be traced. A tower has a purpose. A river has a crossing. A kingdom has a season of peace. Such intelligibility is deeply calming because it reduces the pressure of uncertainty. The mind can relax when it feels that things belong to a pattern, even if the whole pattern is not visible at once. And so we can imagine one more evening in the old realm. The steward has finished the accounts. The cook has covered the pots. The stable hand has checked the latch. The librarian has placed a ribbon between pages. The mason has left the scaffold dark against the wall. The guard at the gate has stamped once against the cold. The queen or king perhaps has set aside the crown and become simply a tired person with a lamp, a book, and a room that is quiet enough for sleep. Outside, the moon glides behind a cloud and returns. The banners stir once and settle again. Somewhere in the outer field, a night bird calls, and then there is silence. The castle has not vanished. The kingdom has not ended. They are still there in stone and story, in memory, and in the gentle architecture of the imagination. Their old roads still meet the river. Their towers still meet the sky. Their records still wait in boxes tied with cord. Their hearths still hold a little warmth after the flames are gone. Their history still rests in layers, like soil, like pages, like worn steps polished by time. And perhaps that is enough for now. Perhaps this is what the bedtime mind most wants. Not an answer, not an ending, but a world that continues softly beyond the last sentence. So let the archive remain below the castle. Let the old map remain folded. Let the well remain deep. Let the banner remain folded in its cloth. Let the wall remain upright against the weather. Let the road remain patient under the stars. Let the kingdom remain a place of quiet continuity, where old civilizations, half-remembered myths, and small daily acts all rest together without hurry. Let the past be distant but not lost. Let the present be simple but full. Let the future arrive in its own time. And now, as the night grows fuller and gentler, let the mind set down its own lantern. Let the stone corridors empty into silence. Let the chambers close their shutters. Let the river keep its silver path without needing to be watched. Let the mountains continue their old, untroubled standing. Let the keep keep. Let the kingdom sleep.